Hello and welcome. I'm Matthew, and if you've been with me for a while, you know that I'm primarily a teacher of floristry, and I have a great interest in things we can grow and use for ourselves and our homes and entertaining. Be those things ornamental, like the roses I grow, for example, or culinary, produce, so on. But I also talk a lot about food. Why? Because my experience of the world has everything to do with food, and not just eating it and enjoying it. That's terribly important. I hope it is to you too. But with the lives we all live today, we need a time to pause and gather ourselves and not only heal up from the wounds of today, but brace up for the, I hate to say, difficulties in combat of tomorrow, but sometimes that's how it feels. And what I have learned, and I hope as you are following along with me, you might learn as well, is the more we can find ways to take tremendous pleasure in our daily experience of life, in ways that we can control, the more impervious we become to the ebb and flow of life's successes and vicissitudes. If something absolutely horrendous happens to you in the morning, but you go home and have a marvelous, soul-soothing meal in the evening, it really helps, particularly over time, when you use food and the daily rituals of, to be a bit cliche, hearth and home, but it's true, the ways we dwell in our residential spaces. When you use that for a daily rhythm, that becomes the very stuff of life. And everything else, maybe you're a doctor, maybe you're a secretary, maybe you're a firefighter, in my case I'm a florist, all those things are sort of dotted over this long, constant foundation of the pleasures of daily life and the people we share it with. That said, I'm a firm believer that the more we can do beautifully for ourselves, the less expensive it is to enjoy a rich and richly fulfilling lifestyle. I got into all of this because as a young person I realized I would never be able to afford to live in the style I liked unless I learned to do an awful lot for myself to very high standard. And that's really what I'm here to share with you. Today we are doing a great classic, and on this idea of the more we can do for ourselves and to save a little bit of money while we do it, I'm making one of the great pies of the American South. It is in fact classic. It is the great chess pie. We'll talk about chess more in a minute. But it has two components. It is the crust, the pastry, and it is the filling. And I want to start with the pastry because that is a universal technique, method, skill, call it what you want. And it is something that I have grown up with as naturally as brushing my teeth morning and night or having a bath before bedtime. In fact, my maternal grandmother was a great maker of, as we called it in the South, pie crust. And I would often just be talking to her in the kitchen, and in the time that I had said something brief, she'd mixed one up and already started making her pie filling. So I want to encourage you, if you want to mess around with doing a pie pastry in the food processor or in your stand mixer, all these things that I have seen done on TV and YouTube and other things, that's fine. But for me, I can get out the bowl, put in a few ingredients, and have the darn thing mixed up in the time it takes someone else to assemble their food processor. So take that as you want, and plus, I then don't have to wash a food processor or a stand mixer or whatever it is. So it's simple. It is very simple. The key is to get good and confident at making it well, and then it's just second nature. So I hope I can help you with that as the first step. Let's get started. In this bowl, we are going to make what is really called, if you think about cooking, culinary tradition and such, pâte brisée is the French name. It is basically an all-butter pastry. And already in here, go to my website, imathertonbaber.com, and select blog for all the recipe and quantities and all of that. In here, I've got all-purpose flour. I have a little bit of salt, a little bit of sugar, and I've mixed them well. That's all. The only thing we're going to add is butter, real butter, not margarine, not some kind of combo spread, real butter, full fat. The higher quality, the better, of course, for all ingredients always. Butter and ice water, though we are just going to pour off the cold water. Of course, no chunks of ice in our dough. So, the method with which we proceed matters. Again, dry ingredients, flour, sugar, and salt. The salt is for a little bit of flavor. The sugar is basically to aid with browning when we bake the crust. So even if you are going to use the same crust for a savory preparation, let's say you wanted to make a chicken pot pie, or a seafood pie, any number of things, a quiche, still put in the teaspoon of sugar. It's not enough to change the flavor, and it greatly aids with browning. So now we have a small challenge, and that is, I have here cold butter, and I want to incorporate it, and I want to create not necessarily chunks, and also not necessarily fine meal. I want flakes, and in the oven, the water in the butter will turn to steam, and that's what will give us a flaky crust. Who doesn't want a beautifully flaky pie crust? So here's how we're going to do it. This is a French method, and it never lets you down. I have taken 2 sticks of butter, that's a ½ pound total, and I'm just concealing it a little bit in some parchment paper. And it's cold right from the refrigerator. I'm going to move this water aside because I've got to do a little bit of banging and I don't want to spill it. So I'm sorry for the noise, but I'm going to use a rolling pin. I like this kind that's just a flat dowel. And if you have the kind with handles and it's hollow, it rotates around a central kind of axle, and some of them have ball bearings. You really lose all opportunity to actually assert yourself on the ingredients. So just use a big thick dowel like this. You can get them from a lot of different makers, and very often it's a variation on a classic French pin. This is a sort of shorter version than what Italians might use for pasta as well. Okay, brace yourself. We're going to have a little bit of bashing up, but it's very necessary. How far am I taking it? I'm going to hit it down until it's, I don't know, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch, maybe even a little bit less than 1/8. The only caution I want to give you is to not crush your paper into the butter. If you do, you will have a dreadful time picking all the paper out later. Just turning it over so I don't put too much trauma on one side of the paper. Okay, that's probably pretty good. What have we done? We have just plasticized the butter. That means it's still very cold, again, right from the refrigerator, but it's malleable. And that's what we need because we are going to incorporate it into the dry mix in our hands. So, you'll see here, I've got these 2, what you might call plaques. Look at that. Lovely thin piece of butter. I'm going to just lay them in and coat them lightly with flour. The last thing we want is them to amalgamate together. We've put them in these nice thin pieces, and we don't want to undo what we've just done. This is very similar, by the way, to the way I incorporate the fat in my biscuits. So if you want another point of reference, or really love flaky pastry-like biscuits, just right here on YouTube, go looking for my biscuit film and you'll find it. Okay, so I've got floured hands, and I floured them right from the dry ingredients in the bowl. And the method is this. I always, when I teach this, I tell people to think about the international symbol for money, which is this. Money or payment. You know, people do this. Even in countries where a tourist doesn't speak the language, they do this, and the shopkeeper knows they're asking how much it costs. So we're going to do that with both our hands. It is mostly a rolling squeeze between the thumb and the index and middle fingers. We're going to move like this. First, just break the fat, the butter, into, I don't know, roughly postage stamp size pieces. That shows my age, doesn't it? Does anyone use postage stamps anymore other than me? But this gets us going. And as you go, just toss them a little bit. You want all the bits coated in flour. If some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, it's fine. We are not going for complete unity. You want bits of butter. And how far are you going to, the traditional word would be cut it in, but instead of cutting, I'm going to say pinch, a kind of rolling pinch. How far are we going to? See, here I go. Pinch it into flakes. Well, I'll show you, so you'll have a visual guide. But I would say some pieces, the small pieces, will be about like panko breadcrumbs or peas, garden peas, and the larger pieces might still be roughly like a penny or a postage stamp, but they will be thinner than they are now because we are putting them through our pressing process. Now, the quantity that I'm making, this is a sidebar while I work, the quantity that I'm making here is usually considered enough for 2 9-inch pies that are not particularly deep. And the pie I'm going to make for you is deep. So, this is really going to make one generous pie shell and a little extra. I'll show you what I do with all of it as we go. So, you see here, I'm sort of squeezing handfuls and then just rolling to press it through my fingers. And this is looking excellent. It is a bit like wet sand, very, very mildly damp sand. And as I'm feeling, I am as much rolling it through my fingers as I am sifting for the bigger pieces to be sure I have rolled them flat. You do want some large pieces, but you don't want them large and thick. So this is looking excellent. Just again, sorting to be sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, now, what I do not want to do from this point is overhandle the pastry. Whether you're making pie pastry, biscuits, anything like that. Once you add the main liquid, that's when you begin activating gluten, and gluten is what can become tough. So, here I can just keep doing this just like I'm going. But once I add the liquid, we need to be efficient, and every single motion matters. So, before I add the water, let me tell you what I'm going to do so you know what to watch for. I'm going to pour some of the ice water from my little pitcher, and I'm going to be conservative. Because when this comes together, and I'll show you how to do that, when it comes together, it should clean the entire bowl. It will basically all pull together in a unified mass. But if you've used too much water, first of all, you might have to try to remedy it with more flour, and that's going to throw off your ratio and give you an odd result. But also, your additional mixing, you're going to create some toughness, and too much water will make your crust shrink in the oven. If you've ever made pastry at home and said, why in the world did it dramatically shrink away from the pie plate? It's because you used too much water. So, we're going to work with efficiency. I'm going to keep the ice cubes from going in. You do want, there went one, of course. You want to work with sensitivity. And I have learned over the years that it really doesn't take as much water as you think it will. If you mix, I hope you can see here on camera, I'm slightly pressing with kind of this thick part of my hand as I use my fingers very lightly to bring it together, because that slight pressing action really lets you know how you're doing. And as it starts to come together, what I don't like to do is then take a dry patch and try to force it into the amalgamated, gathered mass of pastry. Instead, I pour a little bit of water into the dry part and just handle that separately. just like you did the first mass. You'll be much more successful combining 2 or 3 small masses than forcing and forcing the one big mass to take in all your crumbs. And yes, you will have one mass, and you will not have added too much water, but gee whiz, you may not even be able to roll the thing out, let alone get Grandma's teeth through it when you serve her the pie. So, this is looking quite good. I want to show you. You think this is never going to be a pastry, but it is. I'm going to press it just a little bit now. And I think, even as careful as I'm being, it needs a touch more water. The one thing you will learn as you get the hang of it, and there is very much a hang to making good pie crust. It's easy, but there is a hang to it. You see, it's already now becoming one cohesive mass. If you are so cautious, and I tell you this because I'm prone to doing it, if you are so cautious that you don't use enough water, then you will have a crust that is a little bit difficult to roll out. It'll be prone to crumbling. Okay, this is perfect. Now, it's not one of those things that I could pick up and throw across the room like a baseball. It is a bit fragile, but that's perfectly fine. I'm just going to bring it over here. Gather this last little bit, add it to, and show you how I wrap it up and chill it, because what little bit of gluten we have activated, now we want to relax. So, this is here a beautiful kind of ball of a nice cohesive paste. My piece of parchment might be slightly small, but I can still show you. Some people would wrap it in plastic, and instead of that, this is what I suggest. This is parchment paper. We're not going to cook in this paper, so it might as well be wax paper. And just watch my method, and then I'll talk to you about it. I don't want to try to roll it, so I'm cleaning my hands of a bit of it before I do. I don't want to try to show you and talk over it at the same time, because this paper will rattle. There we go. That was sort of like a deli wrap. So I took one piece of parchment. I've got all sorts of pastry here. One piece of parchment, and the long ends I brought together, and I folded them parallel to my chest together, down, 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 and then I simply brought the edges, almost like gift wrapping in a very casual kind of way, together toward the center line, turned it over and crossed it, and now that I've got this little bundle, see it's sealed here on the top, I'm going to press it into a flat disc, and this goes into the refrigerator for at least half an hour, preferably an hour. While that chills, I'm going to slightly clean this up, and I'm going to get set up to show you the chess filling. But be right back. We'll carry on together. Welcome back. I'm glad you stuck around because it's getting really good. In fact, boy, a chess pie day is an exciting day. It is one of my favorite desserts. And even though it is eaten all through the American South, I would say it is a particular specialty in my part of sort of the western edge of central Kentucky. I know nowhere else in all of the South where you ask someone their favorite dessert and a high number of them say chess pie. But it is the case here. I am one of those people. I don't know that it's my very favorite, but it is a favorite of mine. And chess pie has an interesting history that is a bit murky. I've read all sorts of accounts of how it originated, and the most persuasive account I have encountered suggests that historically it is basically a filling, a pie filling of butter, eggs, and sugar. And historically, it was referred to as just pie. What kind of pie? Just pie. It was not particularly a milk pie. It was not particularly a fruit pie. It was not a savory pie. It was just pie. And in the American South, in common speak, if you will, colloquial language, just pie became just pie became chess pie. You see the idea? It's called an eggcorn when language officially works one way, but we hear it in practice and adapted in another way, and yet the new iteration, the new interpretation still reflects the original meaning. So I have a feeling that might be the true story of chess pie. There is also an idea that because sugar is a primary ingredient in the filling, the name chess is a slight variation on chest, C-H-E-S-T, because in the South we traditionally stored sugar in purpose-built pieces of furniture called the sugar chest. And if you are interested in what those look like, Google Kentucky sugar chest and you will find examples, everything from very humble to quite beautifully made of exceptional quality. Check it out. It's very interesting. There's also an argument that it comes from whatever you had in the pantry or your chest. You always had the ingredients around. And the earliest record of it was actually called transparent pudding. And it was in a Virginia cookbook from 1824. But it's basically the same thing. Though because it was not specifically called chess pie in that entry, we don't say that it actually emerged until later, and it's probably a much older recipe, so it's probably an 18th century thing. But it's just as simple today, just as good, and on my point of doing more for yourself to live more beautifully for less, I calculated the math during the break, and I'm making this pie, start to finish, in about $8.50. And if you take out the pantry ingredients like vanilla extract and a bit of cornmeal, including the crust, you can probably do it for $8 flat or a little under. So it's an extremely good value. Cut into 8 slices, that is about $1 a serving, and it's awfully good. So how do you like that? No wonder it is, I read, the most popular, in terms of most searched for, pie for Thanksgiving in America. Who knew? So what do? Here we've got the dry ingredients. White sugar, cornmeal, that's right, finely ground yellow cornmeal, flour, salt, and lemon zest. Then I've put a strainer on top. You'll see why in a moment. Separately, I have buttermilk, to which was added lemon juice, cider vinegar, 2 to 3 tablespoons, cider vinegar, and vanilla extract. I'm going to add some melted and cooled butter to this. So basically, we've got the simplest of all kinds of recipes you could hope for. Combine the wet, combine the dry, and we're going to put them together. Now, eggs are about to enter this mix, but I want to talk to you about how you mix eggs. Beaten eggs seem like the simplest thing, and yet they're often done wrong. So I'm going to show you how to do it the right way. Of course, when you crack an egg, do not crack it on the sharp surface of a bowl or your countertop, for example. Crack it on a flat surface. That prevents any of the blade of the surface, if you will, from pushing the shell or maybe any bacteria on it into the egg. Also, if you crack on this kind of sharp surface, you are much more likely to break your yolk, and sometimes that matters and sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, into the bowl, break the yolks, and then, I'm sorry, this will be a little bit noisy, but you're going to have to beat a lot longer than you think to have properly beaten eggs. And because we are not using any mechanical form of mixing, we're not using an electric mixer and so on in this recipe, this is pretty much the beating of the eggs. Now, how do you test? When you pull it up, see how this falls from the whisk in clumps? That means you're not there yet. You want it to run smooth like water. So, we go further. If I was not on camera, I would beat even more vigorously, but I don't want to make a horrible mess and lose some of my eggs right here with everyone watching. So let's check. Hey, that's getting pretty good. Not there yet, but getting good. And if you say, my word, it kills my arm, don't white knuckle your whisk, and force it from anywhere between here and here. Just relax your shoulder and slowly just learn to make circles with your whisk. And you want all the, whatever you're mixing, to be in aggregate and move together. And when you do that, you can just stand around and do it all day long. You could be the egg whisker for a party of 100 omelets if you had someone else standing there beside you making them for you. So, look at that. See how that falls? Good. We are ready to proceed. I don't want to beat them further because you don't want to aerate this. You just want to break them up, and you could even use a fork. So, I'm going to mix the liquid mixture with the eggs. And then I'm going to pour it through that strainer because, to tell you the truth, anytime I use eggs in a recipe, even if I just make a French omelet or scrambled eggs, I always pour them through. There is inevitably a little bit of coagulated white or the chilese, which is that little bit that's there to feed the embryonic chicken if the egg is going to develop. And if I make a custard, I want it smooth. So, wet into dry could not be easier. Keep myself clean and organized here. Also, anytime you're using a strainer, resist the urge to smash the collected contents through with your spatula. You can tap on the edge to encourage it through. At the very end, help it through lightly, and then with a clean spatula, scrape the bottom. If you begin with the pressing right from the start, you are going to clog the strainer and be less successful. Now, I'm going to return to the whisk, but it is only to incorporate wet and dry. I am not trying to aerate at all. If you've seen my YouTube short, which is also on Instagram as a reel about custard, you'll know that pretty much my strong preference is to stir any kind of egg custard with a wooden spoon or a spatula, but not a whisk. We want it to be luscious and heavy and voluptuous, not airy. So, it's easy as that. Now, this has to go into a pie shell, and I'm going to show you how I roll it out. So stay tuned, I'll be right back. Welcome back, where I am greeting you with our beautifully chilled pâte brisée. For anyone interested, that is spelled P-A, accent circumflex, T-E, second word, B-R-I-S-E-E, and the first of those E's has the accent aigu, which is the same as on the word café. In phonetics, we call it a closed E, but that's another story. For all practical purposes, it is merely pie crust. In my family, no one ever called it pâte brisée. And this is a really good one. So I'm going to show you how we roll it out. And I make very few pies where you have to blind bake the crust before you fill it and then bake the crust separately. I don't like messing around with it. I imagine you don't either. So one of the beauties of this chess pie is there is no pre-baking the crust or blind baking, as it's so called. We are simply going to roll it out, put it in the dish, and proceed. Now, while we're talking about pie plates, this is probably a good time to mention it. I'm using a glass 9-inch deep dish crust. And the size of your pie pan, pie plate, call it what you like, is a little bit of a consideration in this recipe because this filling is scaled to completely fill right to the top of a 9-inch pie plate that is about 2 inches deep. That's standard. So I'm going to experiment today and bake it in the deep dish crust and see if it gives me a little bit more comfort. The thing that can be tricky with the only 2-inch deep is getting it in the oven without spilling. So if that's what you're using, that's perfectly fine. Just put it on a parchment-lined baking tray, as I would suggest you do anyway, and I will do today. Put the rolled out pie crust on the oven shelf that you've pulled out from the oven, and pour your filling in right at the oven, then carefully slide it in and close the door. I don't want you to have a spill. I don't want you to lose your filling. And worst case scenario, if I have a little bit of a surplus margin of crust here, I'll just show you what to do with it. It is always, to quote the late Bob Ross, a happy mistake. So let's get right in. you want to flour your board, your bench, your countertop, whatever you're rolling on, and the surface must be cool. If it's 110 degrees in your kitchen and you're working on some kind of surface that is the ambient temperature, this will be a problem. If you live in a hot place, either save this kind of pastry work for a cool day or do it first thing in the morning before your house is heated up. So, let's see, I can't shake that out well. Let's do it this way. One thing that I hope you learn with me is that I do almost nothing that's complicated, but it's all the little details and all the little wisdom that makes the difference. And in the end, you get an incredibly professional result, and it's cost you no more in time or money than doing it very, very badly. The difference is technique. Now, we're just unrolling this as it came out of the refrigerator, and I can tell that in just a brief chill, it is beautifully cohesed. A little bit of that flakiness came off on the parchment, and I don't want to lose it, so I'm just going to gently scrape it and add it back. Look at that. Waste not, want not. Some people would say that's silly to take the little dregs, but not me. I always tell my husband, and he laughs at me, I said, if there comes a day where we're living in a cardboard box under a bridge, you're going to say, I wish you'd saved that shred of pastry. And he laughs, but you know, I sort of feel we're all a couple of terrible deals from the hand of fate away from an awfully tough time. Okay, so I have floured lightly but consistently under. I'm doing the same over. We can add more, but we sure can't take away. And one technique I'm going to use, I learned this from my grandmother, is as I roll, I'm going to constantly move the dough and redistribute the flour under it. That's going to keep it from sticking. A beautifully made pastry is not particularly inclined to stick anyway. But I'm going to also flour my pin a little bit, and I'm doing it intentionally right over the dough so the excess falls onto it. Now, before I go rolling like a maniac, I'm going to just, see here I go, redistributing the flour. I'm just going to press this out in a generally round shape. And I'm rolling because it's the deep dish pie pan. Here, I'll move this so you can see it. Because it's deep dish, I'm going to roll this entire batch, which, as I said, is for basically a double crust pie. But if there's a margin, which there probably will be, I'll trim it away and just show you what to do then. Okay, because my dough is so flaky, it's cracking a little, and that's perfectly fine. The thing that no one tells you when they do, these cooking shows and such, is that as long as your crust has a filling in it, no one can see if you patched it underneath. So don't feel bad. If you do it in the kitchen when no one's looking, it's almost like it didn't happen. Now, I am rolling, but I am not putting my weight firmly on it. I'm mostly just putting the weight of my arms on the ends of the pin. And as you see very often, I am gently moving it around. Keep it moving. That's how you know it is not adhesed to the board. Now, you can see, I don't know if the camera can pick it up because this is not an angled surface and we don't have one of those fancy tables with a mirror above like in a cooking classroom. But just like a beautiful, like a Kobe beef steak, the butter is marbled through. And we can see some of it is bigger patches, some of it is smaller patches. I am watching as I roll for thicker places that I can try to thin out. And I'm also looking to see that I'm basically maintaining a round shape. If you had to, for example, cut some here to patch some somewhere else, you could, but it's a whole lot easier if you don't have to. Now, just checking to be sure that we are still free moving. It's a little thick yet, but I am plenty big. I'm not pressing this down, I'm just holding it over to check the size. I have achieved plenty of size. So at this point, any additional rolling is only to be sure that it is the thickness or thinness that I want. It is a little thick yet, So I'm going to work it out just a bit further. Now, I hope my looking down with the microphone under my chin is not giving you an absolutely horrible sound, and if it is, I apologize. Okay, now I'm just pulling this back very gently in case there was a little portion that stuck, but look at that, none did. It's just tiny little residue, which really could go to one side. And notice I did not try to move this pastry. I'm going to move my pie plate to the board, so all I have to do is lift it onto the edge and unroll it. Look at that. Look how easy. Now, I have to have a little bit of adjusting, and at this point, don't press it into shape. Lift the edge. Let me do it from the side so you can see. Lift the edge and just use the back of your knuckles to work around and ease it in to the corner where the side of the pie plate meets the base, the flat base. All the way around. And it's as easy as that. We have just been very successful in one of the easiest and yet most rewarding kitchen tasks there is, and yet I don't know that I've heard more people in my whole life complain about something that they think is impossible, and it's simply not. So, my pie plate has a rim that's about as wide as my thumb, and I think that's a good rim with which to work for a tiny little ornamental border. We're going to make it very easy, but slightly decorative. So I'm taking the knife and I'm just going to cut with the blade angled in toward the pie plate so that I have an even border all the way around. And if you find that your blade sticks at all, you can dip it in a tiny bit of flour. Mine is not, but yours might, so I want to show you how to do it in case. There we go. Now, you could re-roll these trimmings for another purpose, but I'm not going to. I'm going to show you what I do instead in a moment. First, here we have our crust. My hands are floury and I don't want to drop it, but isn't that pretty? A thing of beauty. We want to dock it. That means I'm going to be sure that it's down. It is, and then I'm going to take a fork and just poke holes through it all across the bottom only. And you might say, doesn't the filling pour through? It does not. I will warn you, because I recently learned this lesson the hard way. My husband, not these, my husband gave me a beautiful set of professional knives, and I went docking the crust for a really big cobbler, and it bent the tip of one of the knives, and I still haven't heard the end of it, so I learned my lesson. Okay, let my woe be a lesson to you. So all I'm going to do now, all that's in this cup is all-purpose flour. I'm going to flour my thumbs and my index fingers, and because I'm right-handed, I'm going to pinch with my left finger and thumb, forefinger and index finger and thumb, and also with my right index finger. And this is what I'm doing on the side of the crust. And I'm going to move around, I'm going to move forward and turn the pie plate toward me. And as I do, I'm going to move my thumb to the index finger's place, to the index finger's place, all around. You'll see what I mean. Going to just crimp the edge, turn, crimp the edge, need a little bit of flour, crimp the edge, crimp the edge. And there are even more precise ways of doing this. I want to show you the simplest way. So if this is new to you, you feel you can do it, and it's not at all intimidating, because it's not. You can always work on your decorating later. That's very, very easy to do. But if you are not successful with the pie, you might get discouraged and never move on to that next part. I'd feel awful about that. If I'd unintentionally played some part in your discouragement as a competent home cook. Okay, we're nearly around. And I will show you, because I intentionally did not roll the edge. Very often you roll the edge. I just wanted to show you the easiest way. If you have a bit like this or here, where it's not quite pointed with your floured fingers, just give it a little pinch. This is just going around the outside to firm up the precision of that little crimping detail. Now, that's pretty much it. I'm going to give it a once over, so to speak, glance over the whole thing, make sure I'm generally pleased with it, and I'm going to pour this filling in. I'm going to put it in the oven. I've preheated the oven for a long time, at least a half hour. You always want not just the oven air, but the racks, the oven box itself, you want the whole thing equally warmed. I've warmed it to 400 degrees. I'm going to put the pie in, set the timer for 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm going to turn the temperature down to 350 degrees. That's Fahrenheit, of course. Here in America, always Fahrenheit. 350. And this is going to cook, depending on your oven, between probably 35 and 50 or 55 minutes. I don't know your oven, so I can't tell you for sure. Also, if you bake in a tin pan or any kind of metal pan, particularly if it is dark colored, it is going to bake your pie faster, and I never recommend a metal pan for any kind of egg or custard type filling because it heats the filling too fast. Porcelain, if you used porcelain, glazed stoneware, enameled cast iron kind of a pan, it would heat up much more slowly and increase your cooking time, and you might not get as nice of a brown on your pastry. It also takes a long time to cool down. So if you were to use more of a crockery type of dish or a ceramic dish, and you removed it from the oven when it was perfectly done, but then the baking pan stayed hot for longer, you could, through carryover cooking, overcook your filling, which would be a tragedy. So I think that this kind of Pyrex type glass is the way to go, and I'm going to bake it until two things happen. When you insert a tester, of course I would clean this knife before I used it. It could be a clean knife blade, it could be a toothpick in the old days, maybe even a broom straw. But take it in and draw it out, and your tester, whatever you're using, should emerge clean. Also, check it often. And once you get to like 30 or 35 minutes, begin checking it, maybe even every 2 to 3 minutes. When you shake it, you don't want it to wobble like barely set gelatin, but in about the middle third, you want there to be a rather alluring tremble. And that's when you know you can bring it out. And it will set. It will set. It will continue cooking on your stovetop. If you've got a rack, a wire rack, put the whole assembly on the wire rack to cool and just leave it the rest of the afternoon. How soon would I bake it before I want to serve it? I would have no trouble baking it around lunch or even mid-afternoon, late afternoon to serve for dinner, depending on when dinner might be. You could bake it maybe late the day before if you wanted to serve it for brunch or lunch the following day. This kind of pastry really does not hold terribly well with a rather wet filling, which this will be. But yeah, don't serve it piping hot. You need time for it to cool to close enough to room temperature that it has solidified. You could well cut into a hot pie and have done everything right to that point and still have a bit of a soupy mess that does not look beautiful, and that's not the point of a beautiful, efficient, easy to make, inexpensive pie like this. It's all the details matter. Got to get it right. So that's it. I'm going to pour in the filling. I'm going to put it in the oven, clean up here, and I will be back to show you how I serve it. Boy, if there's one thing I'm getting good at, is ending my segment before I've told you everything. So I'm coming back on to show you two things. Look at that crimping. I wanted to be absolutely sure before it went in the oven that you saw what that looked like. This is rudimentary. This is nothing fancy. And look how effective that is. That's the first thing. I wanted to be sure you had a look at that. The second thing is, I looked down and realized I didn't tell you what to do with this nice pastry. So I do with it what my grandmother always did, which was I simply lay it on the baking tray, here on the parchment, and I bake it alongside the pie. Sometimes she would glaze it with a bit of cream, because she was rather indulgent that way, and sprinkle it with sugar. And other times, she would take, this would be a good example, a kind of long piece, and she might press it out a little bit more, but she would give it a very light couple of fingers of softened butter, and sprinkle it with cinnamon sugar, roll it up, slice it if it was big enough to slice, and put them out maybe on a separate tray. If it's cinnamon sugar, that might make a mess, and I don't want anything to complicate the success of your pie. So I'm going to lay these around, and what are you going to do with them, you ask? Well, I'm going to eat them, as I suggest you do as well. It's absolutely delicious. If you want to have ice cream with them as a little cookie to the side, that's perfectly fine, but also while you're making your dinner, just have a snack. It's wonderful. And if your dog or your cat, or I don't know, whatever you keep as a pet, has a constitution to handle it, give them some too. They'll love it. Okay, off to the oven. See you later. We have made it nearly to the end. Thank you for sticking around, and I sure hope it's as worth it for you as it is for me. Boy, yes, this pie might be relatively easy to make, inexpensive, some might say simple, though never basic, and I hope it might remind you, as it does me, of that wonderful line from a song by Dolly Parton, that one is only poor if they choose to be, because this is fabulous. Let's cut it in. It is always a challenge to be sure I want to make sure I go roughly down the middle, sure your slice is going to come out as you hope. And I should say, not everyone has them, so I didn't demo in it, but it would be no great surprise at all to bake this in a springform pan, if that was easier for you. If you had a removable tart pan that was of a dimension to accommodate it, that would be possible as well. And since I told you this serves 8, I'm going to slice it accordingly to show you what size that slice looks like. Boy, as you can tell from my physical presentation, that looks like a small slice to me, but maybe it's just right for you. Let's see. Look at that. I was not at all precious about taking it out, so we could be more precise with additional effort. And as you see, this crust is a bit deep for the filling, as I suspected it might be. I was experimenting with the pan. So if this happens to you, don't despair. It's no less delicious. But if you are concerned about concealing this transition a little bit, you might lightly whip some heavy cream, stir into it a big dollop of either sour cream or creme fraiche to give it a little bit of tang. I think that would be awfully nice with the profile of this pie. Whisper of vanilla extract, tiny, tiny bit, almost unsweetened. So just a tiny bit of granulated white sugar. And you mound it here, and that would certainly distract from the fact that your crust is a little tall, and then someone can break it off with their finger or their fork and use it as a carrier for the cream. That would be awfully delicious. So let's try it just as is. I'm very excited. I haven't had chess pie in a while, and I told you I love it. Don't be scared that it is essentially a vinegar pie, because it's delicious. It is one of those humble pleasures that is somehow more than the sum of its parts. And boy, it's awfully good. I will tell you, I have seen very, very old recipes, I might call them original versions, that, similar to what I was just describing, top this with meringue. But I think that would be a travesty. It's too sweet, and this pie is just about right as it is. Let's see how the pastry fared. I hope you can see those beautiful flaky layers. You would not get that in a shortening or even a lard crust. It's delicious. Sometimes, with an all butter crust, because people handle it too firmly, it's hard to cut or hard to chew, hard to separate from the slice with your fork, and this is none of that. It's tender, it's beautifully cooked, it is crisp, but again, not to the point of being difficult. I think it's fantastic. I am now occupied with this chess pie, and I say without any shame at all, I'm signing off, but I urge you to try it for yourself. Let me know in the comments how it strikes you. Let me know if you decide to make it with a little less vinegar or maybe a little more. As always, the recipe is on my blog, imathertonbaber.com. From the menu, select blog, and there you'll find it. I'm on Instagram at imathertonbaber. I'm on Facebook at imathertonbaber studio-workshop. Happy fall, happy pie. I'll see you soon.